Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum viewers. Welcome to KK in Conversation. Today we are discussing Middle East again, but not in the context of the politics. We're discussing it in context of the leadership, the role of leadership and the leadership crisis in Middle East, how it has affected the peace efforts going on in the Middle East, and particularly the people of Middle East, because the Middle East people are suffering brutality. The one of the main reason for this brutality and whatever they are going through is the leadership. That leadership could be political or that leadership could be civil. We have witnessed both crises of both leaderships, the political leadership and the civil leadership. The audience today, I'm joined by Jihane Bergaoui. She is a senior analyst based in Beirut, Lebanon, where she provides field-based context and conflict-sensitive analysis on the Syria crisis for the broad humanitarian community and donor governments. Jihane has previously worked for several international NGOs and multinational organizations, including the World Bank, the Organization of Migration, UNDP, Amnesty International, and the National Organization for Women. And so, because of seeing her bio, I find her to be the most appropriate person to speak about leadership in Middle East. So, Jihane, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you for joining me and thank you for giving your time to us. So, first of all, let's talk about the concept of leadership. There are political leadership and there are civil leadership. So, how you see which leadership has failed the people most? Because I'm going to read a quote from John Maxwell. A leader is the one who knows the way, goes the way, and shows the way. Which leadership has gone wrong?
So for myself, I'm actually a huge believer in the theory of servant leadership, where the leader is the person who not only sacrifices the most for his or her constituents, but also sets the example. And I think, unfortunately, you're absolutely right that we do have a huge crisis of this sort of leadership model in the Middle East and North Africa region, at least amongst the political class. However, as you correctly mentioned, there is a very rich civil society within this region. And you do actually see this leadership model being replicated across various civil society groups in multiple countries in the region. So there is certainly hope for that in the region.
Yeah, thank you. My second question is how you see because in 3 days back, Lebanon government resigned because they couldn't control the situation. So what are your views on it?
You know, I think until the parliament resigns, I think most Lebanese people, and I myself am not Lebanese, I've only lived there for the last 3 years, but most Lebanese people are so disenchanted with the entire political system. It's not just about the cabinet, it needs to be a complete reshaping of the entire governance structure of the country, which has failed on multiple occasions to really deliver the kind of services that a country at the socioeconomic level that Lebanon is should be giving its citizens. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense to have a country that's this rich, but also can't provide 24-hour electricity to its citizens. Over the last few weeks that I've been living in Beirut, I was literally getting 2 hours of government provided electricity per day. The rest of the time, it was actually my backup generator, which was kicking in. And unfortunately, even the fuel that these backup generator requires to operate, even that fuel was becoming imported less and less. So I think, you know, when you have a country whose citizens have already suffered so much and who have just gotten a new cabinet only a few months ago to have absolutely nothing really changed, I think they're rightfully disenchanted by the entire system. And this is why they have this saying. If you've watched any of the protests in Lebanon, you know, they have the saying, you know, kullun yani kullun. It means everyone means everyone. So they want a complete reshaping of the governance structure in the country, not just the cabinet.
Thank you. So, what could be the way forward in it? Do you think and do you see the wishes of people will be fulfilled?
I think, unfortunately, this last incident might be the thing that pushes Lebanon to the brink where there is no moving forward with this current government structure, and the only way to move forward is to actually change it completely. Because I think, you know, we've gotten to a situation where already the currency has lost about 80% of its value in the last few months. You know, we were already facing fears in terms of the import of basic goods, including food, with hyperinflation making food prices just skyrocket across all markets. So I think, you know, when you've pushed people to the edge to this point, the only way to move forward is with a new system. And I do have hope that that is what will happen in the near future, that is what we will see in the near future in Lebanon, because, you know, people are currently out in the streets in Beirut because they feel like they have nothing left to lose anymore.
Right. And what about thank you for this, covering this very sensitive topic. So, coming to my next question is about the mass immigration that has been going on in Middle East since a decade now. So, it has disturbed the the existence of normal life in Middle East. So, how you see what will it take to for people to go back to their normal lives?
Well, I think this is why I'm so happy that we're talking about this crisis in leadership, because that's really, you know, that is really what we need in this region to be able to support citizens to stay within their countries. People are migrating, you know, not just because they want to leave. A lot of them are refugees who have no other choice but to flee their countries, which are in the middle of really violent conflicts. And so I think these kinds of driving factors for people fleeing the region, at the end of the day, the responsibility is on the government leadership. And I think, you know, what we've seen in this region is it really is a crisis in leadership. Because if you look at some of the worst humanitarian disasters in the world, they are currently taking place in the Middle East. So if you look at what's happening in Yemen, in Syria, in Libya, in, you know, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and even Lebanon, at the end of the day, you can trace a lot of these factors to just a complete failure in leadership. But at the same time, you know, we should be very clear that this is not a phenomenon that's unique to the Middle East. So countries around the world are experiencing a crisis in leadership. So if we look at what's happening in Venezuela, if we look at even what's happening in my country, in the United States, where a failure in leadership has literally resulted in the death of 167,000 people and counting, just because the government has failed to properly respond to the COVID-19 global pandemic.
Yes, you rightly point out that leadership crisis is a very basic reason of the chaos that is happening in Middle East. So from this chaos, a situation that is called as statelessness, the people who have no state, who have no identity, that has those people are increasing. I would say day by day. So what should international community do about them?
I don't think that people should ever be stateless. I mean, I think it's really unacceptable to even have this situation in existence, and I think it's the responsibility of the international community to continue to advocate for these people who have effectively been made voiceless by their respective governments, in order to ensure that they are provided with the rights of citizenship just like everybody else around the world.
Jihane, moving to our one more question, that could be how which countries with under what leadership are you see will move and how they will proceed in the future, And by proceeding, I mean how they are going to benefit the work for their own people, because people, the most important thing is that people are suffering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think so. I had mentioned before that bad leadership is definitely at the root of a lot of the crises that we're seeing across the region. But I also do want to note that the reasons for these crises vary greatly and completely from one country to the next. So while I do wish that it was as simple as, just pointing the finger at one problem, which in this case is bad leadership, and then blaming it for all the problems that we're seeing across the region, I just don't think it's that simple. Because the Middle East is by no means homogenous. Each country kind of has their own unique set of challenges. But what does exacerbate the problem of bad leadership in the Middle East is the deadly combination of weak government institutions and the deeply entrenched involvement of external powers. Almost to the point, when people have attempted to replace their bad leaders with better ones, which we saw during the Arab Spring revolutions in 2011, the involvement of external actors turned what started out as peaceful revolutions into very violent proxy wars, which, as you correctly said, has resulted in the mass displacements of people from across this region. So in terms of solutions, I'm actually a huge proponent of civic education in schools and leadership trainings, starting at a very young age, because I think in that sense, there is a lot of hope in the demographic composition of the Middle East, Middle East and North Africa, actually, where about 2/3 of the population is under the age of 30 years old. So this demographic composition provides an opportunity to have a huge impact within one generation, only by encouraging the development of good leadership skills. But at the same time, there's only so much that can be done to create good leaders. So we don't have full control over whether a student or a young person who has undergone proper civic education curriculums and leadership trainings is going to become a good political leader in the future. So we also do have to make it very difficult for people who have these sorts of authoritarian tendencies to damage the countries they govern if and when they do become leaders, through strengthening government institutions. And I think, I apologize that I keep bringing up my country, the US, but it really is an excellent example of that, because while President Donald Trump has done a lot of damage to the country, it would have been so much worse had it not been for our strong judiciary, which has actually delayed and overturned many of the unconstitutional policies he's attempted to enact. So I think, it really does require a mixture of internal and external pressures in cases where governments need to strengthen their institutions, like the judiciary, which will eventually limit their own powers, and you just don't have that same incentive for these government leaders to do that. Citizens of those countries have to actually make those demands themselves. And that is already happening across the region. As I mentioned, there's been protests happening in Beirut. So there are very active local civil society groups across the region that are actually doing that and amplifying these voices. And when these movements happen, it really is the responsibility of the international community to lift up the voices of these citizens, both through, sometimes just public shaming of governments that do not want to listen to their citizens, but also by continuing to raise up these issues through diplomatic channels and other economic means.
Thank you. I hope the leadership in Middle East must realize, and they must realize one more thing, that is, they are not just politicians. They are leading nations. That nations are suffering. The people are suffering. So when you are leading, you have to be, you have to think above the petty politics. So I hope the people and mostly the political leaders will realize this very basic fact. And coming to the last and my concluding question, that is about the peace plan for Middle East that US announced in US announced in January 2020. How you see that peace plan? Because in the light of that plan, Israel is going to annex the West Bank, and America is supporting them. So how you see this Middle East peace plan is going to work or not?
No, I think it's an absolute disaster in the making, and I don't think it's going to work by any means. I think all it's done so far is just make it that much more difficult for Israel and Palestine to actually come to a real.
Sorry to interrupt you. Let me add one more thing in it. Yesterday, the Turkey Turkey terminated the diplomatic ties between UAE and Turkey. In context, as a reason, in response to the Syria US UAE Syria agreement. So, how you see the UAE and Turkey ties that been terminated by Turkey?
I'm not too familiar with what's happening in the relationship between Turkey and the UAE. These are not two countries that I usually cover. But I can say that if it's in response to the UAE actually agreeing.
Because of the agreement that Israel and UAE had.
Yeah, I think ignoring this UAE agreement for just a second with Israel, I think in order to really have a peace agreement between Israel and Palestine, you cannot just completely ignore one of the main parties in this conflict and just go completely and push in this agreement completely with Israel only. And that's what's happening with this peace agreement at the moment. The US is just continuing forward despite Palestinians voicing their opinion and saying that this is not the peace agreement that they would want to see. And it's actually going to make it much more difficult to really have a credible peace agreement in the future between these two countries.
Thank you. Thank you for this amazing session and your time. And audience, we come to conclusion that Middle East peace plan that US announced in January is very unlikely to be considered as a successful plan. So we hope for better, and I wish and I pray to God that people of Middle East will go back to their normal life one day, and that day must come soon, very soon. So thank you for joining us today, and I hope you enjoyed our discussion and it was fruitful for you. People, see you next time with the next guest. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jihane, for joining me, and
Thank you.
Thank you.